Hello, world. I'm coming to you today to talk to you about special education and the law and pretty much the evolution of special education within the United States. Um, Amazingly enough, in a world where everything is supposed to be free and everyone is supposed to be treated equal, we all know that there were groups of people that at many times were treated differently. People with disabilities just so happen to be a group that falls into that category. So, believe it or not, special education really didn't pick up until this century where it was actually in. So for a long time, there have been people with disabilities, but they were actually put to the side. They weren't allowed to participate. They were not allowed to be a part of. They were not allowed to have free public education due to the simple fact that they had a disability and people did not have any understanding. Speaking of that, students with disabilities they definitely were not granted the right to a free education in a public setting. Before 1965, parents of children with disabilities had the responsibility of pretty much educating their children on their own. So either they had to do what we call today homeschooling, or they had to pay out of pocket to have someone come in to make sure that their children received the same education as students who did not have disabilities. After a while, parents begin to realize that this is discrimination and it's really not fair towards their children. And they begin to form advocacy groups just to bring attention to the public of what was going on and how their children were being treated unfairly. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy created the President's Panel for Mental Retardation, a word that we don't use anymore. That's the name that they used then, and that is what they called it. In 1965, Lyndon B. Johnson, kind of following in the steps of what John F. Kennedy was doing, signed the Elementary Secondary Act, which provided funding for education and is seen by advocacy groups for expanding access to public education for children with disabilities. Even with those two huge moves, by 1970, there were still very few students being admitted into public schools. In 1975, the United States voted to ensure that all children, and when I say this, all children, regardless of differences, should have access to free public education. This law was called the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. This would later become what we know as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 2004, which we all call IDEA. There were many cases that kind of helped shape special education, the laws, the rules, and just to make sure that these students were receiving the same fairness as everybody else. An important case that helped shape education was Hoying versus Doe, US 305 in 1988. In this case, it explained that Congress repeatedly emphasized throughout the act of importance and indeed the necessity of parental participation in both development of the IEP and subsequent access of its effectiveness. So essentially, this means that the parents became a part of what we now call the IEP team. It is not up to just the educator, speech pathologist, the psychologist, anybody that's on that team to make the decision of that child's education. The parent is a huge part and they will become a participant within it. A different type of case that took place, and I live in the state of Maryland, Baltimore to be exact, and ironically, working in the school system, I worked in the school system while this was still in effect. A different type of case that took place in Maryland, it was called the chronologically Vaughn G case. In this matter, it shows where students were put on a waiting list to be assessed to receive services that will help them with their education. If you know anything about special education, if you've read anything on it, you know that that is a violation of the student's rights. Students have the right to be assessed within a timely manner. It's 30 days after the time that the assessment is ordered that the students need to be assessed. Well, in these cases, there were so many people that needed to be assessed, so many students that needed to be assessed, that instead of them finding different ways to do it, they put students on waiting lists, which in turn violated their rights. As a result of this case, Baltimore City Public Schools was put on something called a consent decree. Within this consent decree, the state regulated pretty much the assessments and the things that were done. Students had to have these assessments within a timely manner. There were preventions that were put in place to prevent these students from not being assessed. If these students were not assessed within a timely manner, if they did not receive their services that they were supposed to receive, then these students will receive something called compensatory services. Now, I will say in the beginning of this, because like I said, I was working in the school system when this was going on. In the beginning, they were giving kids computers, they were giving them free transportation to and from school. They were giving them items. I even know in one case where there was a family who received a vehicle. The state did go back and they did review this, and they said, you know what, we're giving compensatory damages out to these parents, but it's not benefiting the child. I can give a computer to the parents, but if I'm giving a computer to the parents for the child, what's saying that the child is the person using it? So later the city went back and they went on this ruling and they made some changes. They amended the ruling. In amending the ruling, it went from giving items to the parents to we're going to give what they call compensatory services. So that means that if your child receives speech services and they're not getting their services and it comes to the table and we find out, then as we have this ruling, we turn around and the child may receive an extra, say, 20 hours of services that have to be done within the time from someone coming into the school giving them extra speech services. The benefit of this is that it betters the child and helps them in a way that they normally wouldn't get that help. The child may only be receiving 30 hours of service, but if we add an extra 20 on because of this child not receiving that service, they're now receiving 50 hours, which should be more of a help towards the child. So as we see, special education is something that's going to keep growing, keep evolving, keep changing. Stay tuned, keep looking, because as times are going on, we're going to start to notice a lot of differences and changes that we're going to see in the world of special education. Thank you.